A quiet but consequential reality is settling in over California, and it's not arriving with protests or dramatic votes. It's arriving through spreadsheets, revised forecasts, and budget math that no longer adds up the way it used to. At the center of this moment is Gavin Newsom, governing the largest state economy in the country at a time when revenue volatility, long-term commitments, and political expectations are colliding. What looks like a routine budget adjustment on the surface is actually a warning sign with national implications, because when California's math gets harder, the ripple effects rarely stay inside state borders. Within the first months of the new budget cycle, the core message became unavoidable. California is facing another significant shortfall after years of whiplash swings between surplus and deficit. Only a few years ago, the state was projecting historic surpluses fueled by capital gains, a booming tech sector, and pandemic-era federal support. Now, revenue forecasts have cooled, spending obligations remain locked in, and the margin for error has narrowed sharply. That shift matters not just for Sacramento, but for how Americans think about the sustainability of ambitious state-level governance. Here's the strongest and most uncomfortable implication, and it lands early for a reason. California's budget struggles are not about a single bad year. They are about structural dependence on volatile revenue streams at the same time long-term social commitments are expanding. When the economy is strong, the model looks visionary. When the economy slows, the same model becomes fragile. That tension is now front and center, and it raises a question that reaches beyond one governor. How durable is this approach when conditions change? If you follow politics closely, you already know that people who watch this kind of analysis aren't casual observers. They're the ones who understand that power isn't just exercised through speeches, but through numbers. And they tend to keep watching because they know the real story usually shows up before the headlines catch up. California's budget relies heavily on high-income earners and capital gains taxes, which means revenue rises quickly in boom times and falls just as quickly when markets cool. That design has been praised for progressivity, but it also creates instability. When tech valuations dip, when stock markets fluctuate, or when fewer assets are sold, the state feels it almost immediately. Meanwhile, expenditures tied to education, healthcare, housing, and climate initiatives do not contract nearly as fast. That mismatch is where the math starts to break. One of the under-discussed pressure points is how temporary surpluses translated into permanent commitments. During years of strong revenue, California expanded programs, boosted funding levels, and made promises that extend far into the future. Many of those moves were popular and, in isolation, defensible. The problem emerges when revenue assumptions reset but obligations do not. That's not mismanagement in the cartoon sense, but it is a governance risk that becomes politically painful once conditions shift. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Is it responsible governance to build long-term spending on short-term revenue spikes, even if those spikes last several years? Reasonable people disagree, but the answer matters now because California is living with the consequences of that choice. This is where budget debates stop being abstract and start shaping real outcomes. As lawmakers and the governor negotiate adjustments, the options are limited and politically costly. Cutting programs risks backlash from constituencies who were promised stability. Raising taxes risks capital flight arguments and legal constraints. Borrowing pushes the problem forward rather than resolving it. Each path carries trade-offs, and none are clean. That's the kind of dilemma that exposes how power actually functions under constraint. There's also a legal and institutional dimension that complicates the picture. California operates under voter-approved mandates that lock in certain spending formulas, especially for education. That means even when revenue drops, some expenditures automatically adjust upward or remain protected. Flexibility is reduced by design, which makes downturns harder to absorb. This isn't an accident. It's the product of decades of ballot initiatives reflecting public priorities. But it also means governors inherit limited maneuvering room. Here's the part many discussions skip. Budget stress doesn't just affect line items, it reshapes political narratives. When a state known for progressive ambition struggles to balance its books, critics frame it as proof that the model doesn't work. Supporters frame it as the cost of doing big things in a volatile economy. Both sides are partially right, And that ambiguity is exactly why this debate has national resonance. About halfway through this story, it's worth acknowledging something subtle. Viewers who stay with this level of detail usually aren't looking for a villain, they're looking for mechanisms. They want to understand why the system behaves the way it does. And that's usually the point where people who value this depth choose to stay connected, because surface-level politics stopped being satisfying a long time ago. So let's introduce a pattern interrupt. What if California's budget problem isn't a failure of ideology, but a stress test of scale? Running the world's fifth-largest economy as a state requires assumptions that don't exist elsewhere. Programs are larger, expectations are higher, and mistakes are amplified. The same policies that might be manageable in smaller states behave differently at this size. That brings us back to leadership. Newsom's role here isn't about blame in a personal sense, it's about stewardship. Governors don't control global markets, but they do control how resilient systems are when markets turn. The question now is whether California's current structure can absorb shocks without constant emergency adjustments. Another pressure point is federal policy. Pandemic-era federal aid masked some structural imbalances by injecting enormous sums into state budgets. As that support fades, states are forced to rely more heavily on their own revenue. California is feeling that shift acutely, especially in healthcare and social services, where federal matching plays a critical role. When those formulas change, states must either backfill or cut back. Here's an ironic observation that deserves attention. California's budget challenges are emerging at the same time other states are looking to it as a policy model. Housing reform, climate policy, and healthcare expansion are often cited nationally. But the fiscal mechanics behind those policies receive far less attention. Ambition travels faster than balance sheets, and that gap matters. If you enjoy this kind of analysis, you're probably someone who doesn't just follow elections, but follows the forces that shape them. And people who do that tend to recognize that budgets are where ideology meets reality. Now comes the debate-driven question that's hard to avoid. Should California slow down its ambitions to stabilize its finances, or double down and ride out volatility in pursuit of long-term transformation? There is no consensus answer. And that's why the comment sections, legislative chambers, and editorial pages are all arguing at once. Not weighing in is almost like opting out of the real conversation. As negotiations continue, every choice signals priorities. Protecting core programs signals commitment but reduces flexibility. Making targeted cuts signals discipline but risks undermining trust. Using reserve signals prudence but only buys time. None of these choices are neutral, and all of them shape how voters interpret leadership competence. Zooming out, the payoff of this story is bigger than California. Other states with progressive agendas are watching closely, because they face similar revenue volatility without California's scale. Courts, investors, and federal agencies also pay attention to how large states manage fiscal stress, because it informs expectations about risk and reliability. There's also an electoral dimension that's impossible to ignore. Budget management has historically been one of the fastest ways public opinion shifts from abstract approval to concrete judgment. Voters may tolerate ideological disagreement, but they react quickly to perceived instability. That's why fiscal narratives often outlast policy debates in political memory. Timing matters here. Economic uncertainty, interest rate pressure, and shifting federal priorities all converge in the next few years. Decisions made now will shape California's flexibility later, and they will influence how national audiences interpret state-level leadership. This is not just a budget cycle, it's a credibility cycle. As Act 3 unfolds, the narrative reframes itself. This isn't about whether Gavin Newsom is good or bad at governing. It's about whether the governing model California represents can adapt under pressure without constant recalibration. That question will shape policy debates far beyond this state. The consequences are tangible. If California stabilizes its finances while maintaining core commitments, it strengthens the argument that ambitious governance can be resilient. If it struggles repeatedly, critics gain evidence that volatility undermines trust. Either outcome feeds directly into national conversations about the future of state power. And here's the final, uncomfortable truth. Budget math doesn't care about narratives. It responds to incentives, structures, and assumptions. Adjusting those takes time, political capital, and restraint. The hardest part of leadership often isn't announcing bold ideas, but managing the quiet arithmetic that makes those ideas possible. For viewers who want to keep following how power, money, and policy intersect, this story isn't finished. The next piece of the puzzle involves how states recalibrate authority under constraint, and that thread connects directly to another analysis already on this channel, where the limits of executive power come into even sharper focus.